Hello, and welcome to this 33rd episode in my series titled Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. My name is Michael Dewan Herrick, and today I'm joined by Jaco Van Zyl. Hello, Jaco.
Hello, Michael. It is nice to be here, and congratulations on your podcast.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And I am going to read out loud what I've written down about your background a little bit here, just to make sure I got it right. Jaco is a South African trained psychoanalytic psychotherapist specializing in trauma spectrum disorders, personality and mood disorders, and affective disturbances related to gender and sexuality. He has a keen interest in group psychology and identitarian developments within ideological political movements. He has written for Merion West and for Critical Therapy Antidote. He is also the co-host on the Critical Therapy Antidote Podcast with Christine Sefein. Is that accurate and sufficient?
That is accurate enough. I think that's current enough.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Well, I want to say that I really appreciate you talking with me today. I've been following you and following your podcasts, and find that you've contributed many important perspectives and insights to the whole conversation. Oftentimes, I think we get really tied up in intellectual and philosophical issues and political perspectives, which I think are essential, to have those, but the deeper psychological dimension of what's going on, what it is that the people who are gripped by social justice theory, what's going on for them.
Right.
The insights that you bring to that, I think, are really valuable. So I'm looking forward to talking about that with you today. Can you provide a little bit more background on yourself? I'm curious, and I'm sure people listening will be interested in what brought you to where you are now, having a critical view on this and having some concerns, personally and professionally. What brought you here?
Well, I think talking about my background would require, I think an episode or two of its own, but I'll be as concise as possible.
All right. I know that feeling. I know that feeling. I have a long history.
Yeah. What do I keep? What do I discard? Okay.
Yeah.
So, like you said, Michael, I'm South African born. I was born in a very small town in South Africa, quite a religious and traditional little town. But that little town was my world, and it was also an environment that pictured the world in a certain way. Like I said, I was in South Africa. I grew up during a time where there were social political upheavals in the country. So we were very acutely aware of what was going on around us politically, and very much aware that we found ourselves in a political state due to decisions that were made many years ago, and decisions that were enforced, and positions that were what shall I say, stubbornly clung to. But it was also a time when there was great transition, and I noticed that people were very hopeful, but also fearful. And I remember this dichotomy that I felt, that yes, there were going to be certain changes that were going to take place in South Africa. Many people look forward to that, but I wasn't too convinced, such that I looked forward to the utopia of freedom that they promised. And after that transition, for about 5, 6, 7 years, we felt the utopian, the euphoria of a democracy, and in no time, the tendency to corrupt and the tendency to exploit started to show its face again. So not only that, but racial rhetoric and gender rhetoric also started to come to the fore back in South Africa, and by all means, we were welcoming the change to a tolerant and an equal society. But also, again, in no time, new villains were created. And very gradually, you could see that the rhetoric started to change, and people were starting to demonize a new class of people.
Mm.
And
Okay.
I remember growing up and being exposed to a type of identity politics where you were encouraged to see groups of people in only a certain light, and other groups of people, again, in a different light. And through my own interactions with African people, I remember with fondness the way I was raised by African nannies. I speak African languages. I can speak 3 of the Sesotho family of
Wow.
languages in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
I always boast and say that I have a mixed heritage because I was exposed to a Western way of thinking, to an African way of thinking. I was given African names in certain contexts. Even as recently as a few
Mm-hmm.
years ago in the space that I worked, they used to call me Jaco Mopedi. So Mopedi is one of the tribes in South Africa, and they called me Jaco Mopedi, or they would joke with me and say, "Yes, Jaco, you're so black, Wadziwa. You know that you're
Okay.
so black, you know." So,
Uh-huh. You were an honorary member of that tribe in some sense, or
well, in a,
you?
this is what people do when they see you participate in the culture. They welcome you. You become one of them. That is beautiful. That is very human.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
uh, so it was, even as a child, it was difficult for me to just see in blanket terms, to view people as either all bad or all good,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
as characterized only by these limited characteristics.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to encounter the human
Mm.
in the individual.
Mm.
So I think there was my early exposure to this conundrum of
Yeah.
groupthink versus the individual. The
Yeah.
individual as a token of the group, or the individual as the individual in its own right.
Yes. Yes.
Um,
Can I just say that's
of course.
beautiful? That's very beautiful. And
Mm,
it's one thing to have an intellectual view on these things. It's another to have a very intimate lived experience with it, which is informing
yeah,
you. I really appreciate that. Yeah.
right. Yeah. Um, yes, and I think there's also something in my personal history. Back in the day, my family environment wasn't the most healthy of environments, and
Mhm.
um, we were bogged down by addiction in our family. At one stage, my mother was a single parent who raised 2 boys,
Mhm.
and my and much older sister. Um, so the difficulties there that I encountered also made me realize that sometimes small decisions repeatedly made that are not the wisest can lead to catastrophe. So
Mhm.
you can't just assume whether it is at a political level or even at a family or an individual level that there won't be a reckoning for the decisions that you make. And
Uh-huh.
that reckoning won't only be yours, but also those whom you will affect by the decisions that you make.
I see.
So
Hmm.
be very, very careful when you start imposing certain social engineering tactics. You might be powerful. You might be immunized because of all your resources
Hmm. Hmm.
against the actual consequences of those decisions.
Hmm.
But other people have more skin in the game than you do.
Hmm.
Be very bloody careful. You might just make
Right.
it worse.
Yeah, I'm thinking of an example in the States in terms of defund the police and how, the decline of the police force, which fits the narrative and the agenda for many people who don't live in those crime-ridden neighborhoods, get to feel good about, but those who live there are not so happy about.
Yeah, there's a fallacy and even a psychological explanation for that conceptualization as well. and we can
Okay.
talk about that maybe.
Okay.
Um, so so I finished my high school career. Again, things were very, very dire in the family. I started studying microbiology and chemistry, and I finished my science degree. And I worked in environmental management for a few years, environmental management and water treatment
Uh-huh.
consultation. And later I returned to environmental management consultation again. But
Hmm.
during that time, I started to study psychology and linguistics. And eventually I returned to university, did my master's degree in clinical psychology. My thesis was on conversion therapy.
Oh, really? Okay.
Hmm.
Interesting.
People's experiences of conversion therapy. So now
Uh-huh.
recently when I heard that people want to regard the exploratory therapy of gender dysphoric children as conversion therapy, I nearly fell over. It is such a capture of a very, very evil and damaging practice. And obviously they want to exploit the sentiments around such evil practice
Yeah.
to further a specific political ideology.
Hmm.
So I started, like I said, so
Right.
I studied clinical psychology, and in 2000, I think 2016, 2017, did my community service work at a prison in Pretoria, and since 2018, I've been in private practice. 2 years
Listen.
ago, my other half and myself, I'm in a same-sex marriage. We relocated to Ireland, and this is where we find ourselves.
I see you. Okay. I just want to check in on the
Mm,
thing about conversion therapy, and I'm
mm.
assuming that you're aware that fairly recently UKCP made a public statement about exploratory therapy is not conversion therapy. They made an explicit
Yes,
statement and
yes,
upheld the right of clinicians to have their own views about sex and gender. And I was quite encouraged by that. And then I still am, but I then came
mhm.
to realize that this was by force of a lawsuit that
Yes, precisely.
pushed their hand. Yeah,
I suspected that. I suspected that there was a bad faith position that they
yeah,
took in
yeah.
because uh, accreditation bodies are very much under the pressure, under pressure by activists and
Hmm.
activist organizations to repudiate exploratory psychotherapy and only to endorse affirmative psychotherapy.
Right,
So yeah, I'm not surprised that it was almost made under duress.
right.
Mm. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Thanks for sharing your story. It really
Mm.
gives
Mm.
some feeling to what we're going to talk about next. I think in terms of where you're coming
Mm.
from. As I said in an email just today, I think I read your piece with Merion West, and that frames several ideas that perhaps you'd like to bring forward and we can talk about in terms of
Yeah.
a kind of psychoanalytic view.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
How do we
Right?
how do we understand the psychology of woke? Yeah.
Mm. Mm. Well, like you said in your introduction, we have a bit of a history of its development, and we know the woke as it is currently formulated, or as it is currently manifested in society around us, or as we call it, critical social justice, is
Hmm.
an umbrella term of several critical theories:
Hmm. Hmm.
gender theory, critical race theory,
Yeah.
queer theory, fat studies,
Yeah.
disability studies, and all those critical
Yeah.
theories where um, within these critical theories there is what they call immanent critique, or the critique of society as it is, but it is society along identitarian terms. So the statement is that society isn't perfect. There is still unnecessary suffering within society. Because of that, we need to identify certain social problems. But instead of identifying social problems, they've resorted to identifying certain social culprits. And that is where identity politics comes in, where their approach to societal issues are not by focusing on things such as trauma-free childhood or disruptive childhood, or where a person grew up in terms of socioeconomic classes, socioeconomic levels, or whether they grew up in an environment characterized by a certain kind of parenting as opposed to a more adaptive way of parenting. Because this approach would be very salient to the actual issues that may have contributed, perpetuated whatever suffering, psychological suffering or behavioral issues the person might have. They instead resorted to classifying the world in terms of oppressor identities and victimhood identities. And in that article, I distinguished between the common enemy worldview and the common humanity worldview.
Yes,
and this is something that I got from The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt.
A very important distinction. Yeah, it is a very important distinction. Yeah.
So the worldview, we know that the worldview is a worldview of splits where there are villains and heroes and victims and executioners. And we know who the villains are. The villains are white, straight, Christian, they call it cis-normative men. And then there's the victimhood hierarchy, and from them further down would be, I suppose, white, straight, cisgender females, and that is how the hierarchy goes down, and eventually reaching, in very intersectional terms, the most oppressed, the most victimized. It's very generalized. You have not much of a choice than to accept it. If you happen to be a gay, non-practicing Christian male like myself, and you disagree with them, you just don't have critical consciousness. So then your opinion does not count. So there is this pretense that they have deduced from people's experiences how society is structured or arranged until they encounter opinions or sentiments that do not agree with that arrangement, and then they just repudiate it. They don't incorporate that into their model. So
well, even in terms of standpoint epistemology, in terms of lived experience, which is supposed to be the prime arbiter of what's true and what isn't, you can be in one of the identity categories and report a different experience, and if it doesn't adhere to the narrative, then it's not valid.
So it is, after all, not a standpoint epistemology. It is an ideological epistemology, and they selectively use this specific epistemology and only incorporate and allow these sentiments to inform theory from the sentiments that actually agree with pre-existent theory. So standpoint epistemology by Sandra Harding, I think that is such a valuable identification of one of the contributing factors to where we find ourselves in this critical social justice times. And she claimed that the oppressor is incapable of appreciating the identity-based knowledge of oppressed groups, assuming that all oppressed groups have the same experience, assuming that the oppressor couldn't possibly have empathy to understand what the oppressed groups are going through, and again assuming that what the oppressed groups decide to be true couldn't possibly be challenged. So there is no built-in regulator. There's no corrective mechanism, and this is what makes critical social justice a radical and totalitarian ideology. It is cultic in the real sense of the word. because there's an
Absolutely.
orthodoxy that you do not dare
Right.
question. And
Right.
should you start questioning it, well, we see what happened to the founder of Stonewall when he started to speak up against the radicalization that is seen within that organization. He was ousted. He was tarred and feathered. They work you out like a
Hmm.
bad bout of diarrhea, like it's nobody's business, right?
Uh,
So, and I think adherents of the critical social justice movement should think about this. You imagine that you're safe. It's a grouping of anaphylactic people who, in a split moment, could
mhm,
could interpret certain words that you say,
mhm.
and in that moment you become the enemy, and there's no reconciliation possible.
Yeah. Right.
That is the extreme uh, position, the extreme destination that this this theory and the psychology undergirding it has brought our
Mhm.
society to.
Right. Yeah. Is it a good moment to shift toward perhaps Melanie Klein
Yes. Mhm.
you know, the splitting process and the early
Yeah.
development and how that gets perpetuated in adulthood and so forth?
Yeah. So Melanie Klein was a post-Freudian, and she elaborated much on Freud's theories because she focused on the psychology of infants during pre-Oedipal periods, so from birth to around 3 years.
Hmm.
And she noticed that very early on, the child experiences their world, their world. There's a lot we need to say about this. First of all, the child's anguish is experienced bodily, somatically.
Hmm.
That's where we need to start.
Yeah, yeah.
They have not conceptualized the anguish. It is a dreadful state to be an infant. There are new sounds. There's delay of gratification. Hunger feels overwhelming. Cold feels overwhelming. When mom doesn't arrive on time, it feels abandoned, etc., etc. There's darkness.
Hmm.
There's disease. So the child is in what we call a very paranoid state, where they view mom as this all gratifying goddess, but not mom as a whole. So they would associate mom in terms of her parts. So there would be a good breast, or mom's good face, or mom's good hand. And when the child is upset, they would experience bad face, bad breast, bad hand. And eventually, as the child starts maturing and the child has a good enough mothering is actually a concept that came from Winnicott, but
Hmm. Hmm.
Melanie Klein alludes to that. Then the child starts incorporating these aspects of mom, and we start seeing what we call whole object relations, where the child no longer relates to mom only in terms of her parts, but the child relates to mom in terms of uh, her fullness, knowing that mom consists of good and not so good, and bad and sometimes not so bad parts. And that
Hmm.
is also the time when the child starts to engage with ambivalence and starting to integrate the good and the bad in one individual.
Hmm. Hmm.
One of the resistances to such integration is the envious impulse. And the envious impulse is when the child encounters mother and the child has as internal distress. And the child, in their desperation, enviously spoils and enviously destroys mother by virtue of its dependence upon mother.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that is the envious impulse.
Yeah.
That the other has something that I need, that I don't have. I'm frustrated. In my opinion, I'm unnecessarily frustrated. So I perceive the other as withholding the thing that I need. And because of that, I want to destroy, I want to spoil the thing that I actually desire.
Right.
And um, look, even in psychotherapy, the envious operation features almost everywhere. I usually work with personality disorders and personality dynamics, and that envious operation is possibly one of the last areas of awareness that a person needs to come to grips with. So this is the scheme we understand from a Kleinian perspective. The alternative, as soon as, or when we have good enough mothering, and when this child projects the destructive impulses into mom, and mom patiently takes those projections, detoxifies them, interprets them, talks to the child, soothes the child, explains to the child, doing so as consistently as possible for several years, the child starts to incorporate this stabilizing mother.
Right.
And that enables the child then to enter into the Oedipal crisis, where they also need to incorporate the paternal function from the actual father.
Okay.
So,
There's another part to this. One is the
right,
split of the mother into good and bad object and
right.
trying to reconcile that in the external world. There's also the internal split, right? The
Course,
internal objects
course,
and coming to a similar
right,
reconciliation internally.
right. So it's almost as if there is a parallel process that takes place.
Hmm.
When the self is bad, the bad self or the bad aspect of the self gets projected onto the other, and the other is also experienced as bad because they're in a symbiotic state. Absolutely true.
Yeah,
Absolutely true. So almost to rid themselves of the badness, they need to insert the badness into the devalued other, and that
right.
is
Project.
projective
Yeah.
identification,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm. Okay.
What I did in that article, I conceptualize what we see within critical social justice and the mass movements of critical social justice, and the emphasis is on mass movements, because in masses our instincts tend to emerge. Because in masses, I mean, if we just need to think of Freud's group psych or mass psychology, group psychology or mass psychology, and the analysis of the ego, that it is within masses that we enter a type of hypnotic state. We're very susceptible to suggestion. The superego gets dissolved, the superego representing the paternal function, and we find ourselves in a type of maternal bliss. It's a state of maternality, and that is when the instincts come out. And these instincts are specifically destructive instincts, uh, desire and greed driven instincts, instincts of fear and anxiety.
Hmm.
And the split operates within this realm of
Okay.
instincts. And we see this with critical social justice, where they refuse to give credit where it's due in terms of the West's achievements.
Hmm. Hmm.
The West can only be bad. I
Hmm.
mean, they even condemn Beethoven and Bach and science and
Shakespeare.
mathematics
Yeah.
and Shakespeare. My goodness, right? So there is no gratitude. There's no appreciation.
Hmm.
There's an inability to contend with the complexity of external reality.
Right.
That's on the one hand. On the
Hmm.
other hand, where it comes to victimized groups, identity determines innocence or guilt. So in victimized groups, nothing they do could possibly be so bad that it couldn't be justified by virtue of their victimhood.
Right. Somebody else is to blame. Yeah.
There's always someone else someone else that is to be blamed, and the victimized groups retain their state of moral bliss and of
Right,
moral purity.
right. Is that the result of joining a group, feeling that you're part of a fold, part of a movement, that somehow you relax all of those other discernments and feel supported in your rage and your impulse to destroy because you're being validated and justified, and you can look around and go, well, everybody else is doing it, I guess, this is the thing to do. Is that
Yeah.
partly explaining why people fall into that?
I think that is part of the explanation. I think there is such a single narrative that has been created and has been broadcast over the airwaves and media, radio, television, prominent figures, politics, education, primary, secondary, tertiary education,
Everywhere.
everywhere.
Yeah.
So they drenched our culture with a single narrative. And we know, again, from a psychoanalytic perspective, that as individuals, we're not an island.
Hmm.
We are connected relationally. So for us to function optimally, we need narcissistic supply. I mean,
Hmm.
there is we know narcissism in and of itself is not a bad thing. There's a difference between optimal narcissism and maximal narcissism. And
Hmm.
usually we see in maximal narcissism this absolute insistence of echoing, confirming, mirroring everything we stand for within this fused object relation between the narcissistic self
uh,
and its environment. That is
right,
extreme maximal
right.
narcissism. But there's also healthy, optimal narcissism
Right.
where we want to be accepted and appreciated for who we are. And if we make
Mhm.
mistakes, to be forgiven and pardoned. And there is there's reparation. Reparation
Right,
is possible. So I
right,
can bear my guilt. I can incorporate my shame, because my shame didn't mean that I was utterly condemned.
right, right,
We are social
right.
beings. So
And I might be
so
jumping forward a little bit, but I just wanted to make the point that
right.
this is one of those elements of this that gets translated into the consulting room. It gets translated into what happens in psychotherapy. If the therapist is indoctrinated in this way, then they're providing the narcissistic supply and just validating and not questioning or challenging, and because that would be considered somehow aggressive or violent or hurting feelings and so forth.
Yes, yes. So our social space has been maternalized to such an extent that the only permissible dynamic between people would be a dynamic of gratification.
Hmm. Hmm.
We only affirm, we only agree. We've seen a breakdown in society to such extent that people know are incapable of disagreeing like adults used to.
Hmm. Hmm.
I want to mention something about the whole narcissism and narcissistic supply, cancel culture, public condemnation. It is very, very difficult to take a stand against a society that's so drenched in critical social justice sentiment, because of this danger of being expelled, danger of being branded as a heretic. And many
Hmm.
people go silent instead, because it is, like I said, it's a painful process of that a person goes through.
Sure.
And they've also weaponized public displays of punishment, critical social justice warriors,
Hmm.
with their minions,
Yeah.
exacting punishment over those who dare to be heretics.
Right. Yeah, it makes it quite frightening. I know I had a process working up the
Mm.
courage to begin speaking myself, and I'm curious whether what you're describing held you back at all before you began to express something about this.
Uh, I noticed my fear. I noticed the risk that I was taking by doing this, and who knows what's going to happen in future when the intolerant mob is going to launch their attacks on me.
Hmm.
It's going to be interesting to see what not only what their response will be, but also what my reaction will be.
Hmm. Hmm.
You see, and this is where not necessarily myself individually, but in observing our culture where I miss religion.
You miss religion.
See, let me explain.
Okay.
I know historically religion has taken part in atrocities of the world. We know it. But we also know that during the time of conflict, that religion emboldened certain individuals to take a stand in spite of the fact that they were going to lose their narcissistic supply from the masses, and that they nevertheless kept their integrity in spite of that
Well,
risk. I think of
Christ might be a prime example of that.
Christ himself is a prime example, and I
Yeah.
think of the person that actually came to my mind would be Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that died in the concentration camps, and he
Uh-huh.
was a conscientious objector against the Third Reich,
Mhm.
while the Protestant churches and even the Mormon Church and the Roman Catholic Church, everybody just endorsed Hitler as the Messiah of the German people.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and that is one of the things that makes taking a stand all the more difficult these days, because you'll be standing alone, and many do not have this utility of religious support, of an internal almighty, omnipresent supporter in the form of God, in the form of Jesus,
Mhm. Mhm.
that might help us maintain our integrity.
Sure.
And to those who are not religious, they really need to dig deep, and they really need to remind themselves and almost evoke and resurrect old internal good objects as support for
That's an
for
interesting
for for
point.
this
Yeah, it's
for their
interesting.
stand of integrity.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
yeah. I see that. I'm
Yeah,
hopeful that as you and I and other people are beginning to speak up, that others won't feel quite as alone. That the more of us who are willing to do this, the more emboldened, perhaps, the
that's
silent
it.
dissenters will become.
I think
Can
that is also support. Mm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay.
Um, if we could turn a corner, I'm just mindful of
Mm.
time, and another couple things that
Okay.
I'm hopeful we could talk about. And this was what I mentioned before we pushed record today. uh, what about so this notion of splitting all good, all bad, and
Mm.
projecting out onto the other, one's
Mm.
internal, unacknowledged parts. Is it possible that we of the so-called anti-woke have the same potential tendency to project things onto the woke, to vilify and demonize and see them as all bad? And assuming that that's true, what could we appreciate about them? What have they
Right.
brought that we could acknowledge and appreciate and see about preserving?
Right. I think I think it's a fair point. I do want to state, though, that as unfair as it might be to split against someone and to be unreasonable in our condemnation, I think it's equally unfair to look at something that is truly worthy of condemnation, to just soften it just for the sake of complying with
Totally agree. Yeah,
some ambivalence,
right.
just coming across as tolerant. I think that is also a bad faith
Yeah,
move.
I
So
totally
I think
agree. Totally
I think it
agree.
is absolutely necessary to state the truth for what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And the woke movement couldn't be phased by reality. We know that because whenever evidence is given, such as what we've discussed here, that they overextend their classification or condemnation of people based on demographics, they blatantly ignore it. So they're not interested in reality to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is, it is a neo-Puritanism. The substitution theory or hypothesis, namely that critical social justice took the place where religion and culture left the
Mm-hmm.
void.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is this new strange morality.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very intolerant type morality. It ought to be pointed out. And
Yeah.
thirdly, that it is narcissistic.
Mm-hmm.
It is absolutely narcissistic, and we see the worst of human instincts coming to the fore within the work.
Right.
I think what we need to keep in mind is what we're seeing here is, especially around the splitting and the envious processes that we observe, that this isn't a woke phenomenon. It is a human phenomenon.
Okay.
And that is what we need to keep in mind, that even though we know what the woke say and we know what
Mm-hmm.
their theories say, I do think that there is value, for instance, in some of the criticisms by Adorno and Horkheimer. The culture industry very much paradoxically prepared the grounds for this takeover. Because the culture industry is an industry where the populace is just a passive recipient of culture, and
Mm-hmm.
they are being entertained by bland
Uh-huh.
culture just because that is what is available
Uh,
and that is what is being distributed over the airwaves. Um, um, uh, that doesn't really strike me as a very healthy society.
mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, the woke actually used this as a means to distribute their ideological propaganda, and people just passively absorbed it. So
Right.
I think there is valuable and imminent criticism to see what is unhealthy in our societies. How could we improve our societies without becoming utopian?
Right. I'm currently embarking on Eric Kaufman's course with
Okay,
Buckingham
great.
University. You're probably
Mm,
aware of that. And
mm,
he identifies three strands
okay,
of values or philosophy going back
right.
to, say, 18th century humanitarianism, egalitarianism, and liberalism, and traces the development of those ideas and the different groups who espoused and promoted them, and the values that they've brought to our culture.
Yeah.
The idea that individual freedom is a good value. Protecting vulnerable groups from harm is a good idea, and egalitarianism, which is as much as possible, can we have an equal playing field for people? And so
Mm,
I think that's once upon a time, that's where these woke ideas kind of came from, but they've overstepped their mark and they've become extreme. And each of these three good values have found themselves in more tyrannical, ideological, and excessive expressions. But I
the
think there is
origins,
some seed of something worth preserving.
right. But their origins are very pre-woke.
Yeah, the
Their
origin.
origins are very pre-woke. So yeah, they're very
Yeah,
pre-woke.
yeah.
I mean, when I think of woke, I think of the the activism postmodernism that started in the 70s and later the 80s when they started to incorporate critical theories into their mix of protest ideologies. But yeah, fair enough. Humanitarianism, egalitarianism, liberalism, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no two ways about it. And just, again, in terms of egalitarianism, to see the other as someone who has inherent dignity.
Yes.
And that is the dignity culture that we've inherited.
Right.
And from dignity culture, this transformed into a victimhood culture, where the person isn't necessarily convinced of their own dignity, and they need the environment to affirm their dignity all the time. What nonsense is that?
Yeah.
Right? So in other words, to have this inherent sense of dignity, okay, you can demand it. But when someone doesn't necessarily afford you that dignity, that doesn't mean that person robbed you of your dignity. You still have dignity.
Exactly.
You have that internal conviction of it, as opposed to demanding that the environment needs to mirror my dignity the way I demand it to be mirrored.
Yeah, no, I
That's not healthy.
agree. This is the snowflake culture, the safe spaces, the trigger warnings, and all the rest of it are devised for the person who demands that the external world preserve their dignity instead of putting that responsibility on each of us, to find and uphold our own dignity.
Right.
And I was reminded of the difference between color blindness and the new anti-racist approach. The inherent dignity of all human beings as the kind of the bedrock, I think, is a colorblind approach. And being forced to categorize people into different groups, whether it's oppressed or oppressing, sets off the whole thing,
It's not adequately recognizing.
Yeah.
It's not it doesn't, you don't, when you engage in such identity politics, you don't see the person as they present themselves, and you don't recognize and I want to be the psychoanalytic attune. You don't attune to the
Yes,
person
right.
with what they give you. Instead, you
Right.
come with this ideas about the person, then you impose it upon them.
Right. And paradoxically, how can you affirm, somebody's dignity if you haven't even attuned with them, if you haven't
Right.
really recognized their particularity, and who they are as an individual? They're just an avatar for some construct you have in your head. That's hardly a way to affirm somebody's dignity. Yeah. Where should we go next? What do you want to talk about next? We have limited time here, but
how many minutes left?
well, 5, 10. I mean, it's up to us.
I think there is something worth saying in terms of the meta narrative that we find ourselves in. When we went back to South Africa for 3 weeks now, I met up with one of my friends there. She is a philosophy lecturer, and I think she will appreciate it if I do mention her name. Her name is Louise, and she will know that which Louise I'm referring to. And we had a fascinating discussion, and I want to credit her for this piece of insight.
Okay.
And so she's a Nietzschean scholar. But one of the things she mentioned in our discussion, she said, "But isn't it interesting that our society and the meta narrative of our society moved from the tragic in the Greek sense to the social?" And I thought that is significant. Now, what I gathered from what she meant by that, and also when we discussed it in greater detail, the Greeks, as contained in their myths, deeply appreciated that there were certain things about life that you couldn't possibly change. Viktor Frankl captured it in his the triad of tragedies, or the tragic triad, that we will contend with death, pain and suffering. 2, 3, guilt and regret. We cannot take that away.
Yeah.
We have to contend with it, ultimately with death and dying.
Yeah. And the
Even within
the existentialists have a lot to say about this as well.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, the existentialists have been infiltrated by the woke as well. Believe it or not, I don't know how they managed to achieve that. But, and that is the tragic, and it's that we need to build our resilience with. The realization that we have limited time here on Earth should spur us on to live as meaningfully and as adventurously as possible.
Yeah. Can I come back to
But
your first statement about Louise? It's the difference between the tragic and the social. And what you didn't say, but I heard there was, as an explanation for human suffering, that the tragic is that life inherently contains these potentials for suffering. The social says suffering is caused by social organization, and it can be ameliorated if we can tweak our social arrangements and dispel with all of this pain and suffering. Is that kind of at the?
That is the point.
Yeah.
That is the point. So the social, so pain, suffering, even death is unnecessary. Because it's unnecessary, there's got to be a cause, a cause that we need to address and we need to eradicate. And then again, we look for social causes, and in critical social justice, social culprits. And if we can just eradicate social culprits, then we will create a sense of utopia and utopian bliss.
Right. And then we can come back to your statement earlier about how these social engineers make decisions about how things ought to be without much skin in the game, and cause all kinds of things that might have been anticipated but weren't, in terms of the damage.
And this perpetually exacerbates even with some of the interventions, because within a social meta-narrative, problems has to be addressed, and if we can just alleviate the problem, the cause of suffering will come to an end. By constantly intervening and even microscopically zooming into micro interactions in the form of microaggressions, we only make it worse. If the person is anxious, and if they have, say, gender distress, and the possible solution for gender distress and anxiety is to gracefully support the person to explore their biology, to explore their distress, and we know psychologically to gradually integrate these realities. That is a difficult process, but eventually that brings about relief, or that brings about the resilience to deal with realities beyond our control.
Right. And
by declaring this a social issue, the solution becomes a perpetuation of the problem, and the solution in a social scheme would be to intervene with puberty blockers and with cross-sex hormones and with surgery and etc., etc. And we know from the longitudinal studies available to us that it does not bring about relief to the internal distress.
Right.
We know that.
Right. And don't we also know that it's 70 or 80% of people who undergo that process turn out that they're gay, and that exploratory work might have resulted in that kind of an integration of
the sexual orientation.
And make the rest of those things unnecessary.
So I think it is also necessary to return to an appreciation, however difficult it is, however it causes narcissistic infliction, because we start realizing that we're not as omnipotent, we're not as omniscient, we're not as powerful as we think we are. We are just human beings. We have limitations. We have limitations. We have limitations. And we know that. We know from the longitudinal studies available to us that it does not bring about relief to the internal distress. We only make it worse. the extent of our power isn't as much such that we're able to rid human existence of the tragic triad, but to sit with this narcissistic injury and to appreciate that we're just human. We have to contend with these tragic realities, and amidst these tragic realities, to try and flourish as much as we can.
Right. Find meaning and purpose and adventure.
Find meaning and adventure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. This might be a big topic, but maybe you could say a few words. What about the future? You know, given all that's been said and this reality that we're confronting for psychotherapy, do you think we're going to make it? Do you think we're going to come through this and the field is going to carry on intact in some way, or is it going to fall apart?
Well, I'm not sure about intact, but I think the field will survive in some form.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there will be lawsuits coming. I think in a different way there will be public shaming and public condemnation because of mishandling of these realities and mishandling of sensitive cases, especially around gender medicine.
Sure.
I also think in terms of overreach, where, say, for instance, the American Psychological Association, where they've endorsed racist conceptualizations in their psychological formulations, where they've endorsed an outspoken anti-Semite in the form of Laura Shee of Division 39, the Psychoanalytic division, and where they've endorsed decolonization and decolonization of all the critical theories. Decolonization is the most destructive and violent form of critical theory.
Have you read Doug Stokes' book on that? Doug Stokes?
No,
excellent,
not yet, but
excellent book. Yeah,
right. But I'm very much familiar with Frantz Fanon's writings.
Okay,
and even where it was necessary for Hannah Arendt to actually challenge him on it, where she reminded him that violence is you try and prevent violence as much as possible. You don't even consider that as a possibility, for goodness sake. And Frantz Fanon, we know that he was a psychiatrist and even psychoanalyst, and he distorted psychoanalysis to such an extent in his writings on decolonization. So I think there is going to be a reckoning of some sort, and I don't think it's going to be with fanfare and with great victory. It's not going to be like that, but it is coming slowly and gradually.
Right.
We will have to take account of reality. You will never, as we say in South Africa, never, with the shaking of hands and everything, you cannot escape the demand placed upon you by reality. And there's going to be a reckoning by, even if it's just to reckon with reality.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. It's inevitable. Exactly how it unfolds and when it unfolds, I don't know. One of the things that I hope will happen is that whatever of value within this ideology can contribute to the field of psychotherapy, I hope we can contextualize it within the broad, diverse tradition that we've been given. And it's not just something to completely brush away. I think it does contribute something to our understanding of the way the social and political dimensions affect people who come to psychotherapy, and we should be aware of it and have ways to work with it when and if it is aligned with the client's agenda, and their view. Just like every other contribution to the field. I mean, psychoanalysis itself persists to today. You're a psychoanalyst, and psychoanalysis has undergone all kinds of criticism and all kinds of, other things have come along to enhance it or provide alternatives to it. And I think the woke ideology needs to take a seat and not try to dominate the whole field.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think it is designed in such a way that it couldn't possibly coexist with other competing theories.
Well,
So
not as
whether
it
it
is.
will
Not as it is.
whether it will hang around while competing theories will assume their position will be left to be, it's left to be seen. But I do appreciate your comment, and even with with the CTA, the way we've discussed our plans going forward, expanding our scope to also include training, we will have to incorporate things such as complaints about racism, for instance, or complaints about sexism, or gender issues and
Sure.
sexual orientation issues.
Yeah.
But we used to know how to handle these issues.
Mm-hmm.
So it had its place in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. It had its place. But this over-ego zealot for a theory came and unfortunately was like a bull in a china shop. And I don't care whether it is still politically correct to say that or not. But it was like a bull in a china shop, and it actually wreaked havoc.
Sure.
And just because it wreaked havoc doesn't mean that we need to deny the existence of unfair discrimination based on a person's identity or identity markers. We still need to grapple with how do we go about addressing these issues when they do show up in the consulting room.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, and I agree. Yeah. And I took your comment earlier to heart that while trying to recognize its value and find a place for it in the field, to not allow that to soften too much the necessary criticism that is required to point out its bull in a china shop nature. And that's something I've been trying to balance on my channel and in my videos. And I don't always get it right, but I'm aware that there's a danger in softening too much. Yes. Okay. Before we end, I wonder if you could say just a few words about CTA for my viewers who may not be aware of it. Just it's a resource for people who are questioning these things. Absolutely. And what can they find at CTA that they might find of value?
So on the CTA website, that's the Critical Therapy Antidote.org website, there are regular articles discussing these issues from psychological perspectives. There are also articles on news developments in terms of gender medicine, for instance, policies, training stances by accreditation bodies, etc. That is where people can find information to keep up to date. We also have a membership scheme where we meet monthly, and with our monthly meetings, we have either a supervision session with Christine as the person facilitating the supervision session, or we have someone presenting us with a talk. We engage with a person. It's usually someone like, prominent enough individuals where we engage with them and just find some inspiration, find some guidance and new insights in terms of the addressing these issues that we just discussed. And then our podcast, we're really looking forward to a range of recordings that we're going to release very, very soon. We're completing our series of discussions on the Holmes report, the recent report that was released by a part of the American Psychoanalytic Association on racism and systemic racism in psychoanalysis. It is a bit of a nightmare report. We're going to complete our series there, and then we're going to start a series of discussions with parents who've had difficulty with their children in gender distress, as well as with the mismanagement of their presentations by affirmative therapists.
I see.
That is a very, very tragic episode in our modern history that we're also going to address. So we have a few interviews lined up, and we're really looking forward to releasing those.
That's really great. That's exciting. And thanks for letting folks know about the wide range of things that they can find at Critical Therapy Antidote. Okay.
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Jaco. I really enjoyed this and appreciate your time and not only with me, but that you're putting into this whole endeavor. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And it is good. It is good to see so many people emerging and so many people taking a stand. And thank you for your contribution too, your insights, your wisdom. There's always a bit from our own story that we can add to this discussion that will hopefully contribute to individual and also societal healing bit by bit. Thank you very much for that too.
You're welcome. Thanks. Well, I guess that's all for now. I hope to talk with you again at some point in the future. All right.
Let's do that.